millennia, people have always migrated, and when we talk about refugees and asylum seekers, these are legal definitions that have been created by governments in order to categorize migrants between people who are seeking refuge and people who are traveling for other means. So if you click twice, Nick, hopefully that'll take us through. So we have asylum seekers and we have refugees. An asylum seeker is someone who has not yet had refugee status. A refugee has. And what do we mean by refugee status? I think that's the next slide. Yes, it is. A refugee is someone, and this will sound familiar to many of you, is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted. That well-founded fear can manifest in many different ways, but you have, this came about as a consequence of the Holocaust, when people were not, when Jews who were fleeing the Holocaust were not necessarily given refuge in the UK, let alone anywhere else. And we didn't have, because there wasn't a mechanism to save them. And the UK was a leading part of this, of recognizing that there was a moral failing on the part of governments around the world to save the lives of Jews. So actually the UN Refugee Convention had to be amended because it was originally, I think, talking only about people fleeing Europe, and was focused on preventing another Holocaust, not simply offering people refuge when they are seeking asylum. So the next slide, yes, great. The reason why we had this is because of all of these features that I think are really relevant. There was nationalism and racism, growing border restrictions. There were people, we were not taking our responsibilities seriously, and there were inhumane conditions for people who were fleeing the absolute worst horrors that were possible or thought of at the time. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that the same thing is taking place. It's exactly the same conditions, albeit at different levels, manifesting in different ways. But there is still growing border restrictions, still conflict and genocide, still rising numbers and profiles of refugees, still states shirking their humanitarian responsibility. So there is no more important time to be doing this work than right now. So let's look at the system. If we look at the global system, there are currently 103 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. Although the numbers of people who are forcibly displaced, and I use forcibly displaced to differentiate between people who don't have the choice or have no choice in leaving, and people like my mother who do have a choice. Whilst the number rises, relative to population, it remains relatively steady. The majority of people who are forcibly displaced stay within their country of origin. They are not migrants, asylum seekers, or refugees. They are internally displaced persons. Of the remaining 48 or so %, many of them are refugees. The majority of the remainder are refugees, people who are found to have a well-founded fear of persecution. There are some asylum seekers, some receiving other forms of protection, and some who are stateless, which is a whole category and a whole seminar or session in and of itself. Over 2/3 of people who are refugees are hosted in a country neighbouring that of their country of origin, which makes sense. People don't want to or cannot afford to move much, so you tend to find people being housed. Lebanon has a very high proportion of refugees per capita, as does Jordan. Currently, Poland has taken in many, but you can see that 1/3 of all refugees are hosted in Turkey, Colombia, which is where Venezuelan refugees are going, Germany, Pakistan, and Uganda. So the UK is not on that list. And if you look at the discourse around refugees today, there's an assumption that it is, and it's simply not. So if we look at the next slide, this is where the situation in the UK. Over half of refugees in the UK, or people who are arriving in the UK rather than actually refugees, so refugees and asylum seekers, are coming from Iran, Iraq, Eritrea, Albania, and Syria. This is the 2021 total. So the 2022 details from the Home Office and the House of Commons Library haven't come out yet. If we were to look at that, Ukraine would probably be number one on that list, so would Hong Kong. This is the latest details that we have. There were 50,000 asylum applications in 2021, 29,000 in 2020. So they are rising. It's true that they're rising, but they are not at their absolute height. The absolute height was in the early 2000s. We are not market leaders in asylum application or granting refugee status. Germany is 4 times higher than us. France is 3 times. If you make it relative to population, we are 18th when compared to EU member states. We are not pulling our weight. We languishing in terms of our obligations. We are much better when it comes to resettlement schemes. The three that have been very successful are the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme. And if you look at the asylum statistics for the past 10 or so years, the vast majority of refugees are from Syria. Then you have the Homes for Ukraine scheme and the Hong Kong scheme. The Afghan scheme is the outlier when it comes to the UK's success as a resettlement country of origin. It's done 22. I'm going to try and go through this next bit quite quickly. Put in the chat true or false. In answer to this question, true or false? You can apply for asylum in Britain by visiting any British cemetery. Wow.
Generation of players. I think
someone is watching the Arsenal game that I wish I could tell, but
actually have boys back in this Man City players. They're desperate to win something.
Are able to
Football club.
Yeah.
That's right. I was hoping to have the football in the background. It's not me, but oh, I think I've done it. Yeah, I've done it.
All right, great. There are a lot of falses coming through. Thank you. It is false. You cannot apply for asylum in Britain by visiting any British embassy. You apply for asylum when you arrive. So Nick, next slide. We're going to look very quickly at the asylum system. So you can apply from within the UK, or you can apply on arrival. There are also the ability to apply for resettlement schemes when they open up, but those are when those happen. The next step is you have your screening interview. That should be within days or weeks, 2 weeks of arrival. It rarely is these days. The backlog created by this government has increased dramatically. Next slide, another true or false question. All asylum applications are decided within 6 months. True or false? Put this in the chat. Thank you, Laurie. Laurie has noticed. So what's interesting in this is that this is part of the presentation I've been doing for a few years. This used to be a harder question than it is now, because it used to be, once upon a time, about 86% of applications were decided within 6 months. Now it's 6%, I think. We'll get the actual statistics in a bit. But let's go to the next slide. It is not true that you get to your asylum interview within 6 months. That's the government statistics and the government's intention to get that within 6 months. We are now seeing people waiting, well, it's quite common to see people waiting for 2 years. It is quite likely to see it going beyond. Then you get to your decision. Nick, next slide. Your decision has one of two results after your substantive interview. You are granted or refused. If you are granted, you cease being an asylum seeker and you become a refugee. And if you are refused, you carry on through the system. Let's go to the next slide. As I've just said, there's refugee status and there's other forms of status as well. Refugee status, by the way, is not permanent. It is a 5-year visa, in effect. Next slide. Then, if your claim is refused, you can go on to appeal. This can take another 2 years, and in that time, you are still an asylum seeker. You're still going to change your status. The appeal can then be accepted or refused. And if we go to the next slide, if it is refused, you can have you can end up facing removal or voluntary return, and this is becoming increasingly likely in the way that the government's bills have been shifting. You can also, at this point, if you have reached, this is great, if you've reached this final point of removal or voluntary return, you can make a fresh claim. And a fresh claim is what happens when you have gone through the whole system and things have changed. The substance of your asylum application will have changed. Now, if we did this whole thing within 6 months, the situation may be relatively similar, but the government ineptitude has meant that it's much more likely that when you get to that final stage after your appeal, you'll have been in the UK for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and there will be grounds to for a fresh claim based on changing circumstance. So it will be either change of circumstance in your home country or change of circumstance for your situation in the UK, being embedded in British society, not working, but studying, having family, these kinds of things that make it more likely that on a fresh claim, you will be able to get your asylum claim approved. These statistics are up here. So by the end, what's happening now is that by and large, people who are coming to the UK do have are found to have legitimate claims of asylum and to be able to get a refugee, status, it is more likely than not that you are a legitimate refugee when you come to the UK through this system. However, this doesn't change many of the challenges that. So let's go to the next slide. This is where things start to get, I was going to say tasty, but difficult. This government has made hay out of the fact that they believe that there are votes, probably, you know, in the red wall, so-called, for their by tackling vulnerable refugees and by seeing them as somehow illegitimate. We see the Nationality and Borders Act that was signed last year that was supposed to be a wholesale change to our asylum system. It did many illegal and unworkable things, including introducing the Rwanda deportation plan, where we spent 120 million in order to have Rwanda take about 120 refugees permanently. This wasn't it was initially about offshore processing, but basically they were going to be permanently taken out to Rwanda, where they will be victim to trafficking, victims to exploitation, maybe facing examples where they would need to be seeking asylum regardless, for example, if they are LGBTQ+. Regardless of the fact that we apparently had a revolutionary overhaul of the asylum system in 2022, we're going through this again in 2023. The illegal migration bill, which is its actual name, it has just had having its third reading in the Commons today, and will then go to the Lords. It is aiming to do lots of awful things, but mostly by utterly criminalising seeking asylum by anything apart from by any means that is not a resettlement scheme, which there aren't at the moment. It will create the provision for the indefinite detention of tens of thousands of people. The government is struggling on detaining the current numbers of people they aim to detain, let alone tens of thousands of people, including children, including the most vulnerable. This is a plan that is both unworkable, illegal, incredibly expensive, and immoral. You know, there's no way in which this is a viable system. It is basically set up to fail, and exists to offer red meat. One of the few things that has changed over the past few years is the method of arrival. These are still considered, they're called irregular methods. So the government will call them illegal, but they are deemed illegal by the government. The government could change that if they wanted. They are, you know, there's regular and irregular is a nicer way of referring to it. So what these means have changed. People were coming in irregularly through the Channel Tunnel on buses. Now they're more likely to be arriving on boats. That's why we have Stop the Boats being a common slogan. If the government did want to stop the boats, there are very simple ways of doing it. Further pushing people into the hands of smugglers by banning the boats will not do it. The way in which you stop people who are desperate is by offering them safe and legal ways to come here, so they don't have to rely on people smugglers. There is evidence from the US that shows that when you open up safe and legal ways to cross from Mexico to the US, irregular migration or illegal migration goes down dramatically, because people simply want to be able to cross. The numbers don't change a huge amount. It's just the method that does. People don't need to risk their lives. So let's go on to the next slide. What you see when you come here to the UK is not simply the end of the road. When you come to the UK after you've gone on your perilous journey, things don't necessarily end well. These are the kinds of things you face. One thing I'll say, because we'll get onto banning from working in a minute, age assessment is a real challenge. Age assessment is where Home Office officials or immigration officials won't believe the age that you state you are, because a child, if you come in and say you're 16, you have 2 years of being a child where you're treated, you have many more legal rights. They believe that people lie about their ages. They use many pseudoscientific methods to prove how old you are. There is no way to prove how old someone is biologically. And by and large, I tend to find in my work, and you may find similar in yours, that people are told that they are, 5-10 years older than they are, even though they are clearly 16, for example. So age assessment is a real challenge for people. Let's go on to the next. I'm bombing through this partly because I appreciate there may be lots of questions, and you will be able to read these later. Asylum seekers are banned from working. The reason why they are banned from working is because the new Labour government instituted this. The new Labour government, in a bid to seem tough on things, basically made life much worse for refugees and asylum seekers in several ways, but this is one of them. An unpopular and quite silly rule to ban asylum seekers from working. They also were removed from the benefit system and live off, currently, give or take, 35 to 40 pounds a week. The amount fluctuates. It is a quarter of what someone needs in order to be at the poverty line, at the relative poverty line in the UK. So asylum seekers are effectively trapped in poverty, in extreme poverty, or not extreme in the legal definition, but severe poverty for using their legal right to seek asylum. That is a completely bizarre situation. So let's look quickly at the next slide. This is Jack Straw, who at the time was Home Secretary, and he said that many claims are simply a tissue of lies. Some of these are on the advice of unscrupulous advisors, simply as a means of evading control. If it sounds like he is a part of the hardline Tory hawks of today, it's because that's the intention. He wanted to sound like that. So this, I think we have to be really clear that the state that our asylum system is in today is a bipartisan effort. And if we want to see a humane asylum policy, it's not simply the case that a change of government will do that. There has to be concerted effort on the part of people who know asylum seekers and refugees well, and the refugees and asylum seekers themselves, to make their claim to both parties about why it is right and sensible to give people the right to work, many rights to simply live a humane and dignified life. Next slide. I feel like an old-fashioned lecturer shouting next slide, but thank you, Nick, for being great. So there is, at the moment, the UK is an outlier in its approach to the right to work. Sarah has said asylum support is now £45 a week. Yes, that is you're more likely correct than I am. My slides are out of date. Apologies, but relative to the aggressive inflation that we're seeing at the moment, £45 is not getting you very far. So we're still seeing people vastly under the poverty line. You are able to work under very specific circumstances as an asylum seeker. Those include being a skilled musician or dancer, classically trained musician or dancer, an electrical, civil or mechanical engineer, a scientist, a STEM teacher, a health professional, a care assistant. These are among the shortage occupations. And often, this is not simply, if I was a science teacher in Yemen, I could be a science teacher in Lambeth, because the translation of qualifications tends to degrade people from other countries, degrade their qualifications. So I've heard about someone supporting one of the few female dentists from Kabul, from Afghanistan. She was an experienced dentist in our home country, and all of her years of training and experience translated to 2 years of an undergraduate degree. So we see people who are being severely set back and prevented from working because they're simply believed to be inferior. So let's move on to I'll show you the next little bit. So after this, there is myth busting as a tool. There are several myths that we'll skate through here. We won't look at, but one way, when you speak to someone who you think would dislike what you're hearing tonight, they may raise a bunch of myths. France, why don't they settle in France? Refugees are a burden. Whilst it is useful to address these myths, we don't want to reinforce them. By myth busting, we're sometimes reinforcing the myths. Sometimes it is better to talk about stories, to talk about narratives. You are people who have incredible stories at your fingertips, the people that you've been meeting at the drop-in. So you should use those when talking to people who may dislike or disagree with what they're hearing from you. But if we go forward to the learning stories and learning more, here we go. There are many ways that you can continue this conversation, continue learning. There are many books, films or TV shows on Netflix. There's also The Swimmers, which is a great film, and people on Instagram, on Twitter, if you are on social media, people who are constantly sharing up-to-date news and ideas so that you can be aware of what's going on. And then on the next slide, you are already doing this, but if you want to take action, there are things you can do. If you want to host, Sarah's here, so Sarah can talk to you about refugees at home if you're interested in hosting and don't know much about that. If you are a student, or you are related to a student or know a student, there are student-based organizations doing amazing work across the UK. There are places you can take your donations, whether it's financial, whether it is items. So take the Bike Project, collect bikes, Screenshare UK, collect laptops. There are mentoring and befriending opportunities, and there is opportunities for taking action with youth. My organization that Nick is actually the chair of, Our Second Home, is the youth movement for refugees and asylum seekers in the UK. We run residentials and leadership training. We do amazing stuff all year round. So if you know people who are interested in youth action and youth movements, point them our way as well. That is it. That was a whistle-stop tour through the asylum system. I will very happily share all of those slides with you so that you can take that in. I hope that there are questions. I'm more than happy to take them, and if there are other people on this call who are better equipped to answer your questions, then I'm more than happy to hear them.